Hello. So today I'm going to talk about how the postmodernists, not only ruined Antigone, but in doing so, attempted to use Antigone to ruin the traditional concept of the family. And I've been learning about this in my classical literature class, where we've been focusing on Antigone and going throughout history trying to find other examples of both women and men who represent the same spirit of Antigone. And we've been trying to define what that spirit is and how it manifests throughout history. And so far we've been sort of interpreting Antigone as the ideal feminine type, where she is bound to her family and kinship ties by blood, and that her highest purpose is to honor that family and to make sure that the laws of the gods, so to speak, the laws that are higher than socially constructed norms or the state authority, to make sure that those kinds of basic and fundamental sort of considerations are upheld. Which, if you haven't read Antigone, or if you don't know the story, go look it up. We're focusing on this idea that the female type is anti-authoritarian and that she was willing to sacrifice herself for her family, which I think is an admirable reading. I think that that's a good interpretation of Antigone, and I think that's what Sophocles intended. And we've even read, second wave feminists and stuff writing in the 70s about how these women see something essentially feminine in Antigone, and that she is performing the ideal feminine role. And part of me likes that. That's an interesting thing, because at least they're treating femininity and being a female and the ideal form of that as something which is rooted in the body, and which is something which is rooted in the physical reality of the blood ties of the family and of the female form and all these things. Irigaray, the writer who wrote about the feminist writer who took this perspective, this gender essentialist perspective, which I guess was still in fashion in the 70s, which is at least one step better than the feminism we have today, which is that there's no such thing as femaleness or being feminine. There's no such thing as gender outside of a social construct of it. There's no essential quality that's rooted in reality. It's all socially constructed. And so the interpretation which goes against that is what we've been focused. That's the traditional interpretation, that there is something that is essentially feminine, and that it is rooted in the female form and in her blood kinship ties, and that her upholding those kinship ties above anything else is what an ideal female would do. And I think that is how Antigone should be read. That is a good interpretation. It's a healthy interpretation. But this past week, we have been learning a very different interpretation, which has been offered by Judith Butler, a postmodern feminist, who, as I said in the beginning, wants to use Antigone as a tool to destroy the traditional family concept. And the way that she does it is by, instead of framing Antigone as the ideal female, the ideal feminine type, she frames Antigone as the opposite of she frames Antigone as the destruction of the category of femininity, the destruction of the category of sisterhood, the destruction of any like traditional concept that has been attached to Antigone. No, she's actually the opposite of that. She's both masculine and feminine. She's both a sister and a mother. She's everything and nothing. And Judith Butler tries to stretch this into saying, oh, Antigone was like a precursor of queer theory, which is that the family archetype, the traditional family concept of a man and a woman who have children, take care of their biologically blood-related children, that's all just a social construct. It's part of the past, and Antigone was a precursor to this queer theory that a family can be anything. A family can be two men with a child that they adopt. A family can be two women living in a house together. A family can be a group of people, anyone. A mother can be anyone. A father can be anyone. These concepts are just socially constructed, and Antigone was both the mother and the sister, and the father and the brother, and the male and the female, and it's the destruction of these concepts, the destruction of these categories that Judith Butler wants to argue for. And she even goes so far as to say that in the future, the story of Oedipus and the story of Antigone will be meaningless to people because nobody will have this normative, traditional concept of a family which involves a mother and a father and their biological children and the traditional relations that they're supposed to have with one another, that people just won't know about. They just won't have any concept of that because a family will just be anything. It'll be this chaotic mess. And so the story of Oedipus, which relies on this traditional family structure to understand and to get any meaning out of it, is going to be meaningless to people in the future. And that Antigone doesn't actually represent any of the traditional symbols that we ascribe to her, like the feminine chaos paired against the masculine order. She doesn't represent any of that because she is both the chaos and the order. She is both the male and the female, so she doesn't represent any symbolic meaning anymore, and she certainly doesn't represent the ideal female. What she represents is the destruction of all of that. And a family can be anything. Like I already said all that, but I find that extremely disturbing. And of course, look at this guy. He's not going to be able to let me in. Good job, buddy. Took up the entire space. So in the future, it'll just be this random chaos where a family will mean anything, and the traditional nuclear. And the professor even said, how many of you were even raised in a traditional nuclear family? I bet many of you have stepbrothers and stepsisters, and maybe some of you were raised by gay parents or whatever. And basically saying that this is what we have to get used to. This is the future. The traditional normal family is not going to be traditional or normal anymore, and that's all a thing of the past. It was a social construct anyway, so it's cool that it changes. But the thing about that is, it's complete chaos, and it's not sustainable. I just got to work, so I'm going to have to continue this conversation in a little bit because I can't just sit here, so I'm already a little late. But so to continue on, there is no future with that kind of chaos. It can't sustain itself. It can't preserve itself. And the natural order of things will always reassert itself because order is self-sustaining and self-preserving. Chaos is not. So maybe we're in a position now where this kind of chaos is being introduced and the family structure is being broken down, and there will come a time when whatever culture or society accepts these kind of ideas collapses. And that's sort of the path that we're on right now. But the natural order will reemerge, and the natural order will reassert itself, and the natural order is the nuclear family structure. There's no other way for culture to be preserved throughout the generations. And that's another part of his Judith Butler tries to interpret Antigone as antigone, meaning generation. So she even says, like, Antigone in her bizarro chaos interpretation means anti-generation, because generational continuity can only be preserved through the traditional nuclear family structure, because that's how you rear children. Children who are reared outside of that environment usually don't do so well, sadly. Obviously there are exceptions, but that is the most healthy environment and social institution for a child to be brought up in. And as soon as we make family mean anything, as soon as a family is just any group of people who decides to relate to each other or get along with each other, or if, like I said, two guys or two women who adopt a child is somehow family, and then we look at the traditional family structure like Judith Butler wants us to look at it, and say that that's an oppressive social construct, then very quickly, the culture loses steam, because it can't be passed down. It's self-destructing. Whereas the natural order of things is self-preserving. So I don't really have much else to say. I just thought that was interesting. This is what we're talking about in one of my classes. And yeah, so thank you for watching.